Hello guys, this is Axter speaking from the Players Council. I welcome everybody in this new year, which I forgot to say last week. And today we are going to take a look at a tier list of free people strategies in movie block by Decipher, with the adjustment that Galadriel, Lady Redeemed, may not be played. Now, how did I come to my tier list? So what are some bases upon which I came to my conclusions? Well, first of all, I judge the free peoples by its capabilities to survive the ninth side, no matter what the shadow player is playing. So it includes some sort of versatility of the free peoples, but also how long it can survive, and possibly one of the least, but not the least important factors is if it pairs easily or well with shadow strategies. Now let's take a look at it. So from other games and other tier lists which have been created, you might know the system of tiers. That means that you start with 0, that is considered to be the top of the best. Then you have 1 and 2 and 3, and generally number 2 is very rarely to be seen in tournaments. Number 1 is still very much playable and it can achieve victory in a tournament quite often. And tier 0 is possibly the best that you can come to a tournament with in a given format. And because there are multiple strategies in each tier, and I wasn't quite able to decide exactly what would be the best of them, so I at least tried quite subjectively to put there my personal opinion, what I think is the best, and now I'm going to show you why. So the tier 0A, we have the Ents. The reason why this deck is by me considered to be the best of the movie block format is that it can defend itself against anything. It is quite dependent on Saved from the Fire being drawn, but the deck includes a lot of cards here in this version which are meta dependent. That means what is being played at this moment in the format, in my local play group or the tournament that I want to be involved in. So possibly, if I know nobody plays wounding decks, I can easily cut Have Patience, then I can cut one Wizard is Never Late, because only 3 copies I want to take by Saved from the Fire when it arrives early. And possibly, instead of Have Patience, I can cut Grown Suddenly Tall, I can maybe add 1 copy of Roll of Thunder if there are too many Corsairs in the meta, and so on. So it is eventually not that many cards of the free peoples. Very strong deck, very reliable and resilient, and therefore I consider it to be the best of the best. Right behind that is going to be the Saved Gondor deck, which is very much the same, but it works not with Ents, but with the Gondor companions added by their artifacts. The reason why I think this is slightly worse than the Ents is that it is dependent on the artifacts. So if something discards them, such as, for example, Groaned, I'm going to show you the card. So this can discard an artifact, and then Elendil, instead of being 14, which is his maximum strength from Narsil, he gets down to 8, and he gets easily overwhelmed by the Great Hill Troll, which is a very important power spike in the Besieger matchup. Of course, you can add more copies of Roll of Thunder to prevent this from happening, but draw is always going to be different, so it might happen that you lose to Besiegers just because you are not playing Ents, so you need to hit the meta a little bit better. On the other hand, where this deck is stronger than the Ents is against Hillman, because Elendil basically says that Hillman cannot defeat this matchup. It is not 100% true, but in most cases this is going to be victorious against Hillman. So very similar build in the end. Now we take a look at the 0C tier, which is the last alliance. In my opinion, from the perspective of a shadow player by nature, this is the most difficult deck to defeat, which on the other hand doesn't make it the best free peoples in the format, because not only free peoples matters, but also the shadow that you play with it. Due to the amount of copies that you play in this deck, which are unique, and also counter cards which you usually cannot afford to cut, such as Stand Against Darkness, because then big murder minions are going to stop you very easily. You need to play a certain shadow strategy that fits well to this free people strategy, usually Corsairs. And Corsairs, for instance, don't have a very good matchup against Ents or Saved Gondor. That's why this gets a little bit behind Ents and Saved Gondor. On the other hand, just with the starting Fellowship, Frodo, Glorfindel and Greenleaf typically, it is able to survive much longer if the draw is bad. Also, you can play any companion that comes, unlike with the Ents, where you sometimes have to spot 2 Ents in play, which you don't have. So it is a little bit debatable, but still, in my opinion, it is a little bit less versatile due to its necessity to be paired up with certain shadow strategies that support how the deck is built. The last from the 0 tier are dwarves. This deck is better in one way than the first 3 which I have shown, and that is that it costs nothing. Of course, there are some cards which are expensive, such as Aragorn, Radagast or Faramir, but they usually do the work for the Twilight cost that you pay. So, to give you an example, let's say that you are playing against a swarm strategy. So, on side 4, where the first power spike typically comes, you pay 1 for Gimli, 1 for Durin, 1 for Linar, and up to 4 for the scythe, so that's 7 Twilight. Your opponent usually runs runners in swarm strategies. That means that he's even able to add Twilight to the pool. So actually you can get 8 minions swarmed on side 4 just with the 3 companions, and you can die. If you play Aragorn, your opponent is going to play those minions anyway, but you are going to survive because Aragorn is going to swallow most of these minions and you will live to fight another day. And where on the other hand this deck falls behind compared to the first 3 free people strategies of the tier 2 list, which I mentioned, is against certain matchups. It is very difficult for dwarves to defeat Gollum, because Shelob in general prevents Durin from being assigned for the entire turn, and as you can see, and probably based on your experience as well from Movie Block, you know that this deck is really strongly built around Durin, who is the core character. And Gollum basically works around that, which is not good for you as a dwarves player. You can of course counter that by playing clever hobbits in the deck, instead of, for example, playing Lord of Moria, or maybe Faramir, if you know that there are no Easter eggs in the format, and so on. There are ways how to deal with that. A little bit more difficult it's going to be against Hillmen, that's why Saved Gondor is better by nature. But against Hillmen, War Club is a problem, then in general you are not able to do much against Elder into Freka into over the Eisen, which means your opponent needs only 8 Twilight, then he takes control of a site, he assigns Freka to Linar, there he just boosts up Freka by Burn Every Village, and on the second side he does the same with the difference that Elder is already 12 damage plus 1 fierce, usually added by a War Club, which is a deadly combination for you as a Dwarves player, and it is very difficult to run to the 9th side or even survive against Hillmen. That's why this is the last deck, but still very good in the tier 0 list. Now let's take a look at the tier 1. So what is the core difference here? Well, either the deck has a very big problem against certain card or certain strategy, or it needs to be paired up with something specific which has downsides. I'm going to explain on the first example, which is the tier 1A telepathy. Not really sure why it was called this way. You can do the homework and Google it up. On the other hand, my best guess would be that it is because telepathically you make the minion 0 strength and make him go home without doing anything 4 times in a game. That is very frustrating for the Shadow player to deal with. Also, especially because this deck is practically a choke. Once you get Gandalf and 1 more companion into play, you want to keep at 5 companions, and then you just overwhelm whatever minion is dangerous to you, and you run and nothing can stop you, usually. There are many cards which are low cost, high reward, such as Glimpse of Fate, Forearmed, Curse Their Foul Feet, and so on. And also, you play Gandalf, so that means that you have all the events necessary to discard conditions, possessions, get rid of dangerous minions, and so on. Your Fellowship that you start with is also very versatile, just like with the last alliance, because you have Greenleaf, you have Glorfindel, so high strength against big minions such as trolls, Greenleaf against swarming you, and your Ring Bearer works with Forearmed as well, so you are extra protected against that. Now, why is this not tier 0? Because so far I have said only positive things about it. Firstly, because Terrible as the Dawn kills your deck on just one side, because your opponent can play 4 copies of this in his Besieger's deck, and then you die. Once it arrives, you usually do not have the potential to discard 2 elves, or if you do, you die anyway. Now what you can do instead of that, you can play Frodo, but then you do not have any protection for Frodo. You are dependent on killing off minions by Legolas, discarding your opponent's swarm setup, and killing minions with Terrible and Evil, and that's it. Maybe something around Glimpse of Fate, so your Ring Bearer is always going to be vulnerable in some way. And the last important fact about this deck is that you need to pair it up with a Shadow strategy that has expensive minions. And believe me when I say, if you want to play a competitive Shadow paired with this, which you do because you want to win the tournament, let's just expect that. And the best deck there is in the format are Besiegers. So it looks something like this. You have 4 copies of this guy, 2 or 3 copies of this guy, and then there are the guys that prevent wounds from happening, lots of trolls, some reactions to 6 companions, and perhaps 2 copies of Sauron, 2 siege troops, and 3 trolls of Gorgoroth, something like that, plus the engines and so on. So you play this because the average Twilight cost of minions you hold in your hand is really high. It could be something around 6 or 7, and that is very good for you because you are able to overwhelm minions, and you then, when your opponent tries to catch up with you, can play those expensive minions to punish his double moves. So very good combination that makes it tier 1A, but still not enough for tier 0. Now tier 1B is saved Rohan, sorry. So it works on the same principle as Ents or saved Gondor. You just burn a companion at the start, and then you are able to play Rohan companions. This, in my opinion, if the draw is bad, is probably one of the strongest decks to survive and stall the game for as long as possible. Because Eomer in general cannot be overwhelmed very often. Then you have extra servants for protection of your ring bearer. And of course you can discard conditions, so your opponent cannot make any setup. You can add Roll of Thunder to the deck. When a companion dies, you replace it with another, and so on. So the deck in general is very difficult to kill off. Now some disadvantages. Making a double move with this deck is usually difficult, because Eomer is just about strong enough to take 2 wounds from anything, but he's not able to kill anything off. Not with this build. This build is mainly built in such a way that it survives against lots of shadow strategies, but it doesn't aspire for surviving the 9th side. Tier 1C, Dauntless Hunter. This is a very frustrating deck to deal with, because Dauntless Hunter makes the Twilight cost of each shadow event and shadow condition +1, and if you do manage to put these conditions and some sort of setup in play, then Elrond, by his Villia, which you can play by the 1 ring, just for 2 burdens, stalls the game even longer. And also, it doesn't pay much. As you can see, the average Twilight cost of the cards in your deck is very low. If you manage to reduce the number of cards in the deck because you are able to predict the meta in a certain way, then you pay even less. And you have less cards in the deck, and that is great for you. Now, what is a problem for this deck? Well, in general, Corsairs, because it doesn't have any way how to deal with possessions, I mean shadow possessions, and it is not worth it to play those cards in the deck, because it would be just very complicated to add that to the deck. So against decks like Corsairs, it is more likely going to survive long enough for the shadow to win, but against many other strategies it is going to be very good. Against Gollum it probably also has bad matchup, against Hillman as well, but the rest, more or less, it is able to defeat, and some of it even with relative ease. A very good deck to play. On the other hand, quite fragile against the matchups which I mentioned. So that is something to keep in mind when you select your deck for the tournament. Tier 1D are going to be Knights, which work on a very similar principle like Dauntless Hunter. I would say that this deck is at times, and given a certain meta, even stronger than Dauntless Hunter. It might even be stronger than some of the other tier 1 decks, but it is very, very vulnerable to Saruman's power. So typically what happens, side 2, Castamir with Halberd, then 2 companions are killed. And for those who have played this deck, the magical number of knights on board is 3. As you can see, exert 2 Gondormen, which is bad for you, or just spot 3 knights to do something. Here again, exert 2 Gondormen or spot 3 knights. Spot 3 knights. And that is very important for you to have 3 knights in play at all times, because then you are able to use your conditions very efficiently. But if 2 knights already die on side 2, then you have a very hard time getting back to the 3 knight companions on board, and therefore the matchup against Corsairs is so difficult for you, because Corsairs have no problem of running, for example, these 3 copies of Grima and 2 copies of Saruman's power, which is the most scary thing for you. So technically, what could be a good meta to play knights in? Well, possibly something where there are lots of knights, there are lots of Ents, so people do not want to play Corsairs because they have a bad matchup against Ents. So you decide to take knights, because your opponents might decide to play something like Golem, or perhaps they are going to play roaming murder, and so on. I'm going to show you some of the shadow strategies next week. And that is it for tier 1. Tier 2, as I mentioned before, oh apologies, one more from the tier 1, which is Sam Gimli Choke. Now this deck I was wondering about whether to put it in tier 2 or tier 1, that's why I sort of forgot about it, because originally it was in tier 2. This deck is mainly so strong because it provides your shadow strategy with such a great support. In terms of surviving the 9th side with this deck, it is not very easy to achieve, because mainly you try to support your shadow by choking your opponent, therefore he cannot draw his crucial free people's cards to survive. You also draw extra cards and you destroy your opponent's setup. So very strong deck to play in combination with some aggressive shadow strategy. That's why you see it in those notorious shadow all-in decks. On the other hand, as I said, it is not able to survive the 9th side very likely against most strategies, because it is just very fragile. 3 companions in the deck. If you add extra companions, then if they come early you have to discard them, or you play them, you pay extra twilight cost. It is 99% of the time not worth it, so very complicated to aspire for the win with this shadow, with this 3 people's strategy. Now finally, let's get to tier 2. The first one to look at is archery. Sorry for the low creativity of the name of the deck, but what this is about, well, in general, you want to kill minions before they enter skirmish. So it's very simple. You play Greenleaf and you play Eowyn and you just wound everything, and then, because you are wounded up, you heal it by Elrond, Galadriel, Shadow Between, and you don't pay that much twilight. So it is quite strong. On the other hand, making the double moves can be very difficult, because then you can have a very hard time dealing with your opponent's punish for your double move. So that's why it is tier 2, but still a very good shadow strategy. If you know that your opponents, for example, play Besiegers, or perhaps they play Southrons, because there is quite a high amount of healing cards in your deck, so you can survive for a relatively long time, and it is quite simple to play, so something very nice for a beginner. On the other hand, this is probably not going to win a tournament very often, because there are just better alternatives, but I wanted to show you this deck as well. Tier 2. The only reason why this is tier 2 and not tier 1 is that it is extremely difficult to play. Perhaps in the future I might do 1 or 2, let's say, videos about how to play this, and involve even some live play. But in general, this deck can run very quickly, giving your opponent a very hard time of stopping you, because he just keeps holding 3 people's cards, and discarding just 1 per regroup phase is usually not enough. So you pull out your important Gondor companions, you make them big, then when something dangerous is put on board, you discard it by What Are They, supported by Gondorian Merchant, and when you know that your opponent's hand is stuck and you have a free way, then you just use Elendil's ability, you run, you use last throw, you run, you use 1 more last throw, you run, you are on the 8th side, and your opponent doesn't have any way of killing you off, because all he is holding are 3 people's cards. So a very strong 3 people's strategy. On the other hand, as I said, very difficult to pull off. That's why it is in tier 2. but it's something to keep in mind. Perhaps I should say what can be a problem for you. Well, in general, any shadow strategy that can play cards from discard pile. Good adapt for that would be Morgul Swarm with Morgul King and Evil Smelling Fence and Squealer and so on. It could be also Ninja Golem with its ability to remove your companions from or prevent them from being assigned for the entire turn, so that can be very awkward for you to deal with. And in general, Southerns probably are also going to give you a hard time depending on the draw. Alright, now the third from the tier 2 list is going to be Preparations deck and any form of it. The way this works is that it's basically dwarves, but you actually don't start with Durin, you start with Gimli and Sindri. So the starting fellowship is very fragile, but it's also very resilient because the companions and the equipment in the deck is very low cost and very high reward. And generally you want to play this at 30 cards in your free people's deck. You want to stack important shadow cards on your preparations card, and then by the time your deck is empty you want to shuffle the condition with the setup cards back into your deck, and you want to kill your opponent with that. It is typically paired up with the Southern that adds archery to Twilight Pool according to how many sides you control. I'm going to show you which one I'm talking about. Is this guy. But it essentially works with any other shadow strategy. You are able to create your setup and put some pressure on your opponent, and when he's just about dead, you do the trick, you draw the perfect shadow hand and you finish him off. The last strategy here is going to be shadow play. This deck is more of a fun deck than it is a resilient one. It is, on the other hand, able to survive for a very long time, unless you hit some dangerous early Saruman's power and then 2 companions die, which can be very awkward, but you are usually able to recover even from that. Running for the 9th side is something that is very difficult for this deck, and also you are dependent on what shadow strategy you play with it, because you very much rely on don't look at them and finishing off minions that you exert by shadow play. And for that reason this deck is last of the tier 2, but still quite versatile, and it can give a hard time to many shadow strategies which usually do not expect this sort of deck, such as Southerns, the Southern Archery, because overall just putting back Merry and Pippin to your hand can be a very big problem for you as a Southern Archery player. Alright, and that is it from all the decks which I have prepared from the 0, 1 and 2 tier lists. Anything else, unless I forgot something of course, but I don't really think I did. Anything else would belong to tier 3, that means winning a tournament with that would be extremely difficult. It is not impossible, but it would probably be a combination of very high luck and opponents' mistakes, and you having good draw and them generally choosing a very weird meta, and therefore those decks are probably not even worth ever taking to a tournament unless you just want to have fun. Now, what decks I talk about, it could be Ringbound Rangers, which are more popular in Towers block and perhaps Towers standard, but in movie block they would be hard to pull off. Then same goes for Solo Smeagol Ringbearer, because there are just not enough cards in this format yet. And make no mistake, the deck is very strong, but it starts only with the introduction of the 11th and 12th edition, that means War of the Ring, and then later on expanded and perhaps standard. Next up would be Wraiths, which is also a very funny and interesting deck. The Undead Army, undefeatable, but reliant on one single condition, that when it gets discarded, the whole beautiful idea falls apart. Not quite as undead as they might seem in the first place. Another deck would be around a card called These Are My People, which some of you might not know, so I'm going to find it really quickly. It is this card right here from the Towers block, from the two towers, or from the Battle of Helm's Deep, and it works in a very funny way. You discard your deck using the and I forgot the name. Oh yes, Ever My Heart Rises. You discard your whole deck and then you play everything on your companions with Aragorn's signet. So that is something that is probably difficult for your opponent to read and difficult to play against, but it only looks like it does a lot of things. It is actually not that resilient and versatile as it might seem in the first place. And the last deck is going to be Shoulder to Shoulder, some sort of a variation again around this Elven card, which is actually quite difficult to play against if you have a wounding deck, but the wounding deck should usually run condition discard anyway, so if your opponent keeps spamming healing dwarves and then elves from the allies and then back again, then you just discard the card and then you do your own thing, or at least stop the free peoples. Alright, so those are all the free people strategies that I was able to come up with. If there are any more that you would specifically like me to talk about and rate them according to how well they would stand in the tier list which I have prepared, then I will be more than happy to provide you with some feedback, what I think about the idea, and that is it. Next week I'm going to focus on Movie Block's Shadow Strategies tier list in a very similar way, and then we will see what I will come up with, or perhaps what somebody will request. Thank you for your attention.